I was saying to someone earlier before the service this morning, it wouldn't be a sermon from me without a meme, without at least one meme. I'm one of those people who on social media, his posts exists entirely of reposting someone else's meme. I'm that person. And here's a meme that I get a chuckle from every time I see it. Can we bring it up? I have never insulted anyone. I simply describe them accurately. I'm sure we all know someone to whom we could apply that particular sentiment or idea. The kind of people that makes us think, what on earth, when we look at them? Our use of words and language can be extremely powerful. It can not only hurt people, but can also form our reality. It can contribute to forming our theology and our idea of what is right and wrong, and what is acceptable and what is not acceptable. And that idea, once formed, influences how we interact with other people, how we treat them and see them. It influences whether we associate with them or not. And in the church, it can influence whether we see them as saved or not. In the congregation that I spent my teenage years, there was a woman in her mid-20s. She married young and had a 12-year-old son. So you can imagine that there was some discussion within the church about her moral standing. How old was she when she got pregnant? But that wasn't the biggest scandal that the church saw in her, this particular congregation. Now, in this particular congregation, this church, all the members wore a uniform. And so she, like everyone else, wore the uniform. And that's where the scandal arose. She wore the wrong colored stockings. Well, the gossip that ensued as a result, all the assumptions about the state of her salvation. Husbands began forbidding their wives from associating with her in case she led them astray. Wives gossiped about her. Despite having a heavenly singing voice, she was dismissed from the choir. The minister even took her aside and prayed for her salvation, counseling her back to the path of righteousness. But to no avail. She kept wearing the wrong colored stockings. And sometimes she didn't even wear stockings at all. To her credit, that didn't stop her or diminish her faith and devotion. She loved to do community work, visiting people, helping them in their hour of need. Unfortunately, she wore a motorbike. She rode a motorbike. Now, I'm not sure if anyone has ever seen a woman riding a motorbike, but I believe it's quite difficult when you're wearing a skirt. And she would, in her uniform, which included a very tight skirt, hike that skirt up and get on the motorbike and ride it around. I'm sure I saw some of the women nearly faint and some of the men needing to be taken to the nearby cardiac unit when they saw her ride off from church one morning. But yet I had no problem with her. I got on quite well with her, and the people in the congregation saw me as doing some sort of missionary work when I would deign to speak to her. Our ideas of what makes someone acceptable or not impacts how we see them. A few years later, when I was in ministry in that same denomination, one of my responsibilities was coordinating the church's response to national disasters. That included overseeing the coordination between welfare agencies and government agencies, and ensuring that victims of national disaster received the welfare help they needed. On one occasion, I was visiting one site when I saw a welfare worker from the church say to a gay couple that had come for help, "I'm sorry, you'll have to go to the end of the line. Your lifestyle means that you aren't as eligible for aid as others who are living a good life. If there's anything left over, we'll let you know." A few years after that, I was in placement in a residential addiction rehab center. A gay guy with HIV came in to get clean from his addictions. His partner paid for the full cost of the program, but one of the managers there refused to allow the two to see each other. When all the other wives and girlfriends of the other men came to visit, he was refused access to his partner and was told that the reason he was an addict and had HIV was because he was gay. Unfortunately, this was at a time when such discrimination was legal. In fact, I'm old enough to remember when it was legal to be dismissed from employment because you were gay. And after I was asked to leave the ministry because I was gay, the denomination I attended decided to take pity on me and allowed me to be employed as an office junior. About 8 months into the role, I was called into the manager's office. I was 30 at the time. I was called into the manager's office and told, because of your lifestyle, you are required to keep too many secrets about yourself and not be honest. Therefore, I don't know if you are being honest with me or the church in your work. I can't have anyone work for us that we can't trust or believe they are being honest. Now, there was no recourse for me back then because that was legal under the law at the time, some 20-odd years ago. Now I've got an idea of how old I am. I tell you these stories because I think that if we can identify with any aspect of those stories, we can perhaps identify and begin to get our heads into the story that we read from in Matthew's Gospel this morning. It's a very, very difficult story to get our heads around. In this story, we have a Canaanite woman coming to Jesus for help. Nothing unusual about that. People came to Jesus all the time for help. But there is something a little different in this interaction. So let's take a look at the woman first, because we're actually given a fair amount of information about her. In Matthew's version of the story, the woman is a Canaanite, a non-Jew, and from a group of people who were traditionally enemies of the Jews, perhaps not necessarily from Canaan, but a Gentile, a person with whom Jews normally would not be permitted to associate. Now, in Mark's account of the same story, he refers to her as a Greek born in Syrian Phoenicia. Not only was she non-Jewish and a woman, but was also Greek, meaning that she likely worshipped the pantheon of Greek gods and was probably black, as she was identified as being Syro-Phoenician. What on earth was this woman coming to Jesus for? You couldn't get a person who was more despised by the Jewish people, someone who was considered to represent the epitome of uncleanness in this woman, if you tried. About the only thing that could have made it worse is if she was a leprous prostitute. And being Greek, with the kind of hedonistic lifestyle and what we know about the Greeks at the time, she was, shall we say, most likely a little bit more liberal with her expression of love. And that gives us a bit of an idea of how scandalous the story is. Now, Jesus' response is quite interesting. Ordinarily, the response by people around her would have been to completely ignore her and walk away. That's what the disciples, those people who had been ministering with Jesus and who you think would understand what he is all about, were urging him to do. Not just ignore her and walk away, but send her away. Effectively told her to bugger off, to put it nicely. But Jesus didn't do that. He stops and talks to her. Now that alone would have raised eyebrows. Jesus deigns to talk to her. His response is not what we would have imagined from Jesus. From our modern perspective of fighting for inclusion, we might be a little taken aback at Jesus' interaction with her. It seems a little out of character to refer to her as a dog, as we heard in the story. That's not the inclusive Jesus we have come to know. Or perhaps it is. See, I'm old enough to remember, now that you know how old I am, I'm old enough to remember when part of the fight for inclusion was to use and own the language of the dominant culture, as offensive as it was. Words like queer, lesbian, and gay were all used in a derogatory way to put us down, disenfranchise us, and exclude us. It was what was shouted when people were being bashed and killed. But we used those words to be able to engage with the culture and in our fight for equality. And now they are a sign of inclusion and identity. Similarly to the application of the term used in this passage, I believe. The point is, Jesus is actually speaking to this woman. And that gives us a clue that something is about to happen, and that he is seeing her differently from everyone else around him. Jesus' acknowledgement of this woman and his decision to engage in conversation with her from that cultural perspective was actually a major act of inclusion. In using this language, Jesus was getting the attention of those around him and getting them to a point of listening to him and saying, wondering, what's going to happen next? The woman then dares to respond to Jesus, probably knowing how she was perceived by the people around her, and uses the language of the dominant culture. Now that tells us a little more about the woman. She's actually a powerful woman, a forceful woman who is willing to do whatever she has to do to break through the crowd. Just the fact that she made it to Jesus illustrates her determination and power. So you have to be pretty good, have a pretty good self-image, solid self-image, and confident in your identity and self-worth to push through all that garbage that was around her, push through all the looks and stares and comments about what she's doing here, and comments to go home and leave us good people alone. You have to be pretty sure of yourself. So we have a powerful woman who pushed her way to Jesus and spoke to him. But it's even deeper than that. The term that the woman uses here when she says, have mercy, is much deeper than what we think. It doesn't just mean be kind to me or have pity on me. The term mercy, particularly in this context, refers to a mother's love for a child she bore in her own womb. The woman is saying, love me like a mother loves her own child. I see myself as your child and you as my mother. She knew who she was. Even if no one else around her could see it, she knew who she was. I imagine her response to Jesus might have brought gasps from the people around her. How dare she speak to Jesus like this? I imagine that those around her might have been getting ready to stone her at that response. All eyes are now on Jesus. How is he going to respond to her? And this is where it begins to get interesting. Her response prompts Jesus to not only heal her daughter, but declare that she has great faith. Now, there's nothing in this story that mentions she came to some epiphany about faith. There is nothing here to suggest that this Greek Syrophoenician woman converted to Judaism. Up to this point, there's been nothing said about faith, full stop. In fact, Mark at least goes to great lengths to highlight the fact that she was not a Jew and had no faith in the eyes of those around her. So why would Jesus say that she had great faith? See, I don't believe it has anything to do with her belief that Jesus could heal her daughter. Let's take a look at the placement of this passage. The passage immediately before the story of the Canaanite woman's faith talks about the things that make people clean or unclean. And the Pharisees and Sadducees and those in the crowd held their position based on their understanding of the law that certain activities made a person ritually unclean. And give them credit where credit was due, a strict reading of the Jewish sacred documents supported their view. Being unclean meant a person was excluded from the community. There was a near impossible list of observances that were needed to be avoided, such as certain foods. There were certain physical conditions and diseases that meant you were unclean, some of which could not be avoided. You needed to wash your hands a particular way. You needed to avoid certain fabrics in your clothing. You needed to avoid certain people, which included avoiding certain people from certain places. Enter our woman. In that passage about things that defile, Jesus challenges this notion of clean and unclean. He tells the gathered crowd that nothing external from us makes us unclean. No job, no diet, no physical condition, no relationship, nothing external from us makes us unclean. The only thing that actually makes you unclean, if anything, was your attitude. The things we do and say that tear down relationship, things like murder, adultery, sexual immorality, theft, false testimony, slander. The sting in this speech from Jesus is the recognition that many of the religious leaders engaged in some of these practices, particularly when they denied justice to people that couldn't afford to pay for it, or denied them access to the temple if they couldn't afford the required sacrifices. The religious leaders engaged in theft by insisting that only the sanctuary shekel be used in the temple, and then charged exorbitant exchange rates that amounted to theft. When the leaders paid witnesses to give a particular testimony so that they could gain a conviction. However, Jesus wasn't just talking about what makes a person unclean. The flip side was also true. Just as what a person says and does, that which comes from their heart, makes a person unclean, the things a person says and does from the heart can also make a person clean. They mark a person as having faith. And that's what Jesus noted here. He used this woman, whom the people despised, as an example to shame them. Her ability to push through the opposition, to stand up to her persecutors, to go against all that was considered right and dare to speak to Jesus, to demand inclusion and recognition and not be silenced, to demand to be seen and heard, that was her faith at work. Not a profession of any doctrine, not some baptism that many people saw as a cheap way to get out of legal difficulties. Her actions demonstrated her faith. Her actions placed her alongside other outcasts in the New Testament who were included and challenged the status quo. The woman who touched the hem of Jesus' garment, the woman at the well, the centurion who asked Jesus to heal his life companion, blind Bartimaeus, Zacchaeus the tax collector, the lepers that came to Jesus for healing, the centurion Cornelius who was baptized by Peter after Peter was rebuked by God for calling anything unclean, the Ethiopian eunuch who was baptized by Philip, all of whom were excluded by the people and considered unclean, yet all of them were included and shown to have greater understanding of faith than any of the religious leaders. It eventually resulted in Paul saying in Galatians 3:27, "There is neither Jew nor Gentile, neither slave nor free, nor is there male and female, for you are all one in Christ Jesus." That, I believe, is a message for us today. We don't have to think too hard to come up with examples of people being excluded for who they are, or who are considered by many as unworthy of inclusion, like the woman in our story today. There are people still alive today who can remember, to our utter shame, when First Nations people were legally and constitutionally counted among the animal species of Australia and weren't even considered human. It's not too long ago that people were ostracized for having a particular medical condition. Just talk to anyone who either had or knew someone who had HIV from the 1980s until relatively recently. And even now, people with HIV are still considered unclean and to be avoided by many people. They still have to live a secret life. Here, in this story, we have Christ saying that no one is unclean. No one is unworthy. Here, in this story, we have Christ telling us that faith is not about doctrine. It's not about confession. It's not about whether you adhere to certain ideas of holiness. Faith is about taking a stand. Faith is about pushing through the garbage that is hurled at us by those those we expect should know better. Faith is respecting and honouring the divine presence within each and every one of us and saying, I am worthy. And when we cannot stand, we demand to be seen. We demand to be heard. That is faith. That is faith in action. When Ruby Bridges pushed through the crowd and went to school in 1960, that was faith in action. When the 78ers walked down Oxford Street, that was faith in action. The list goes on and on and on. When we stand up for the rights of those who are denied rights, that is faith in action. When we give a voice to those who have no voice, that is faith in action. When we risk everything, like the woman in our story did, to gain justice and to be seen and to be treated equal, that is faith in action. I believe that's why Jesus said to the woman in this story, you have great faith. Not because she simply believed that Jesus could heal her daughter, but because she stood against those who would oppress her. There's no reference in the passage to the woman saying, I believe you can heal my daughter. This isn't about belief. This isn't about healing of her daughter. This is about a woman who honored the divine within her and took a stand. Even though she must have known that to take a stand risked everything, including her life. How do we demonstrate faith today? Perhaps if this story were retold in modern times, it might be that gay couple coming to the church welfare office and saying, no, we won't go to the back of the line. Faith is costly. Faith requires us to honor the divine within us. Faith says to you, you are worthy. Again, the question I leave with you, how do we demonstrate our faith today? In the light of the example of this woman, how do we demonstrate our faith today? Amen.